The smoke rising from Alistair McLeod's chimney was the only sign of life visible through the whiteout. What made his cabin the only warm shelter for 20 miles during the blizzard of 1859 would change how settlers built in the northern Rockies for the next 3 decades. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The cabin was cold again. Alistair McLeod added another log to the fire and watched the flames climb, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. It was never enough. Outside, the Montana winter held the land in a grip that had lasted 3 weeks without breaking. Inside, his wife Moira coughed into a blanket, the sound wet and rattling in a way that frightened him more than he wanted to admit. The year was 1858. February had arrived with temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there. The McLeod cabin sat in a small valley 15 miles south of what would eventually become Helena, surrounded by pine forest and far enough from other homesteaders that help, if needed, would be days away. The cabin itself was typical of the era. Logs notched at the corners, chinked with moss and mud, a single door, 2 small windows, and a stone fireplace that Alistair had built himself the previous summer. It had seemed adequate when they finished construction. Now, watching Moira struggle to breathe, adequate felt like a death sentence. Alistair was 31 years old, a Scottish immigrant who had left the Highlands 5 years earlier, seeking land and opportunity. He had found both in Montana Territory, claiming 160 acres, and building a life from timber and determination. Moira had joined him 2 years ago, and their son Duncan had been born the following spring. The boy was 3 years old now, sleeping in the small loft above the main room, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The fire burned, but the heat seemed to evaporate into the walls. Alistair could feel cold air moving through the cabin despite the flames. The gaps between logs, the spaces around the door, the very structure itself seemed designed to bleed warmth into the brutal winter outside. He had chinked the walls carefully in autumn, packing moss and mud into every visible gap, but it wasn't enough. Cold found its way inside regardless. Moira coughed again, pulling Alistair from his thoughts. She had been sick for a week, a cold that had settled into her chest and refused to leave. The constant exposure to cold wasn't helping. Even with the fire burning continuously, the cabin's interior temperature hovered somewhere in the 40s. At night, it dropped lower. They slept in their clothes under blankets and still woke shivering. The woodpile outside was running low. Alistair needed to cut more, which meant leaving Moira and Duncan alone while he worked. He looked at his wife, saw her pale face and the way she huddled near the fire, and made his decision. He dressed in his heaviest coat and stepped outside into air that burned his lungs. The cold was immediate and absolute. He made his way to the woodlot 50 yards from the cabin and worked quickly, cutting and splitting with practiced efficiency. The work took 2 hours. When he returned to the cabin, arms loaded with split wood, he knew immediately that something was wrong. The fire had died to embers. In 2 hours, the interior temperature had plummeted. Moira lay collapsed near the hearth, unconscious. Alistair dropped the wood and rushed to her, but her skin was ice cold. He rebuilt the fire frantically, wrapped her in blankets, held her close. Duncan woke crying. The temperature climbed slowly, but the damage was done. Moira never fully regained consciousness. 3 days later she died, pneumonia and exposure stealing what the cold had already weakened. Alistair buried her on a hillside overlooking the valley and returned to a cabin that had failed to protect the person he loved most. Alistair couldn't stop thinking about the cabin's failure. Spring arrived in 1858, melting the snow and revealing dead grass beneath, but the warmth brought him no relief. Duncan played outside while Alistair sat at the table, staring at the walls that had killed his wife. Not the cold itself, not the pneumonia. The walls, the structure, the fundamental inability of the cabin to hold heat when it mattered most. He visited Moira's grave every morning, walking the hillside trail in silence. His mind circled the same problem endlessly. 2 hours. He had left for 2 hours to gather wood, and the cabin had gone cold enough to kill. The fire had been burning when he left. Good coals, fresh logs. But the heat had simply vanished into the Montana winter, escaping through gaps he couldn't see and spaces he couldn't seal. Other homesteaders visited to offer condolences. They brought food and kind words. They didn't understand why Alistair asked them detailed questions about their cabins. How thick were their logs? How did they chink the gaps? Did their fires burn all night? How much wood did they consume each winter? The question seemed strange in the context of grief, but Alistair needed answers more than sympathy. He walked to Rory Quinn's homestead 3 miles east and studied the construction. Standard notched logs, 10 inches in diameter, moss and mud chinking, the same design as his own. He visited Matthias Keller's cabin 5 miles north, identical methods. Everyone built the same way because everyone had always built that way. Fast construction, adequate shelter, constant fire required. That was the frontier formula. But Alistair kept returning to a memory from his childhood in Scotland, his father's root-cellar, a stone chamber dug into the hillside behind their cottage, 4 feet underground, accessed by a wooden door. They stored potatoes there, turnips, carrots. The vegetables lasted through highland winters that could be as brutal as anything Montana offered. Alistair remembered descending into that cellar in January when snow covered the ground and ice hung from the cottage eaves. The cellar was never warm, but it was never freezing either. 45 degrees, perhaps 50. Stable, constant. The potatoes never froze. He had never questioned it as a child. Root-cellars worked because they were underground. Everyone knew that. But now, sitting at his table with widow's grief turning into obsession, Alistair questioned everything. Why didn't the potatoes freeze? The ground above was frozen solid. The air outside was below zero for months. But 4 feet down, the earth maintained a temperature that preserved food perfectly. The earth itself was warm. Not hot, but stable. Warmer than the air in winter, cooler than the air in summer. The ground at a certain depth didn't care about surface conditions. It maintained its own temperature regardless of what happened above. Alistair stood from the table and walked outside. He looked at his cabin with new eyes. The structure sat on the surface, exposed to every temperature extreme the climate could generate. What if it didn't? What if a cabin was built like a root-cellar, not just near the ground, but into it, using the earth itself as insulation, as thermal mass, as a buffer against the killing cold? The idea seemed impossible. It also seemed inevitable. Summer arrived and Alistair left Duncan with a neighboring family while he traveled to Fort Benton. The journey took 3 days by wagon, following rough trails through territory that was still more wilderness than settlement. Fort Benton served as the primary trading post for the region, where steamboats from St. Louis delivered goods that couldn't be produced locally. Alistair arrived with a specific list and money saved from 2 years of trapping. The timber merchant's name was Howard Reed, a practical man who had supplied lumber for dozens of frontier cabins. He listened to Alistair's order with growing confusion. Logs 16 to 18 inches in diameter, 50 of them stripped and ready for construction. Reed set down his pencil and looked at Alistair carefully. "That's timber for 3 cabins, maybe 4, Reed said. "You building a fort?" "A cabin," Alistair replied. "1 cabin." Reed shook his head. "Standard logs are 10 to 12 inches. 16-inch logs are excessive. 18-inch is wasteful. You'll pay triple the normal cost." "I'll pay it." The order included other unusual items: 20 gallons of pine tar, heavy planks milled to 3-inch thickness for the upper level, iron brackets and bolts, a collection of supplies that made no sense for conventional construction. Reed filled the order because money was money, but he asked questions. "What are you building that needs logs thick as tree trunks?" "Something that holds heat," Alistair said. The wagon returned to his homestead heavily loaded. Neighbors noticed immediately. Rory Quinn rode over the day after Alistair's return, ostensibly to check on Duncan, but clearly curious about the massive logs stacked near the building site. Rory walked around the timber pile, estimating board feet with a trapper's practiced eye. "That's enough wood for half the valley," Rory said. "What are you planning?" "A new cabin, better than the last one." "Better how?" "Logs are logs." Alistair picked up one of the 18-inch specimens, running his hand along the stripped surface. Thick logs hold heat like stones in a fireplace. They absorb warmth. When fire burns, radiate it back when fire dies. Thin logs can't do that. They're just barriers, and poor ones. Rory considered this, then shook his head. "Heat escapes regardless. You're wasting timber that could build proper structures for 3 families. This is grief talking, Alistair, not sense." Matthias Keller visited 2 days later with similar concerns. The German homesteader was older, more experienced, and spoke with the authority of someone who had built successfully in harsh climates. He stood looking at Alistair's supplies with obvious disapproval. "Conventional methods work," Matthias said. "I survived 30 winters in Bavaria, 10 here. Standard cabin keeps you alive if you maintain the fire. This," he gestured at the oversized logs, "this is excess born from tragedy. Build normal. Move forward." But Alistair had already begun excavation at his chosen site. 4 feet deep, the foundation trench grew daily. Neighbors watched him dig and called it madness. They called it a grave for a cabin that would never work. Alistair kept digging, kept planning, kept remembering potatoes that never froze 4 feet underground. Alistair selected his building site with care that bordered on obsession. The location sat on a slight rise 30 yards from the creek, elevated enough to avoid flooding, but close enough for convenient water access. More importantly, the rise provided natural drainage away from where the cabin would sit. Water was the enemy of any structure built partially underground. Alistair needed the earth to insulate his cabin, not drown it. The excavation began in early July 1858. Alistair marked a rectangle 16 feet by 20 feet and began removing soil. 4 feet down was his target depth, below the frost line that could heave and crack foundations during winter. The work was brutal in summer heat. Each shovelful of earth had to be hauled away, piled strategically where it could be used later for berming against the exterior walls. Rory Quinn rode past one afternoon and stopped to watch. Alistair stood chest-deep in his excavation, sweat-soaked and methodical. "You're digging a cellar," Rory observed. "A foundation," Alistair corrected. 4 feet deep for a cabin foundation? You building a castle?" Alistair climbed out and wiped his face. "The earth 4 feet down stays at 45 to 50 degrees year-round. Warmer than winter air, cooler than summer air. If the cabin sits in that earth instead of on top of it, the ground helps maintain temperature." Rory looked skeptical. "Ground's just ground. It's cold in winter." "The surface is cold. Deeper earth isn't. Check your own root-cellar. Root-cellars are for vegetables, not people." "Why can't the principle work for both?" Rory had no answer, but his expression suggested he thought Alistair was wasting time on theory instead of practical construction. He rode away shaking his head. Alistair returned to digging. The foundation itself required 2 weeks. Alistair lined the excavation bottom with flat stones, creating a level base and a barrier against moisture wicking up from below. He built drainage channels at the perimeter, trenches filled with gravel that would carry water away from the foundation rather than letting it pool. The attention to water management was unusual for frontier construction, but Alistair understood that his design would fail catastrophically if the foundation flooded. With the foundation complete, the log work began. The massive timbers were even heavier than Alistair anticipated. Each 16 to 18-inch log required careful handling. He had spent weeks treating them with pine tar, coating the entire surface of each log to preserve the wood and create a moisture barrier. The treatment made the logs dark, almost black, and gave them a weight that made positioning them a test of leverage and patience. The first course went down on the stone foundation. Alistair fitted each log with obsessive precision, using wedges and a hand plane to create contact surfaces that touched along their entire length. Between each log, he packed a mixture he had developed through experimentation: clay from the creek bank, horsehair purchased in Fort Benton, and more pine tar heated until it mixed into a thick paste. The compound was waterproof, flexible, and adhesive. As it dried, it created a seal far superior to traditional moss and mud chinking. The lower level rose slowly through August and into September. 12 courses of massive logs, each one carefully fitted and chinked, each one adding to the dark, heavy structure that looked more like a fortification than a home. By the time Alistair positioned the final log of the lower section, the walls stood 5 feet above the surrounding ground level. Combined with the 4-foot excavation, the total lower structure measured 9 feet from foundation stones to the top of the uppermost log. The weight was extraordinary. Alistair estimated each log at 300 to 400 pounds. 12 courses around a 16 by 20-foot perimeter meant the lower walls contained thousands of pounds of dense wood. That mass was exactly what Alistair wanted. Wood held heat. The thicker the wood, the more heat it could absorb and store. His lower level was essentially a wooden thermal battery designed to soak up warmth from the fireplace and radiate it back over hours. Then Alistair did something that confused everyone who had been watching his progress. He stopped using logs. For the upper level, he switched to horizontal plank construction. 3-inch thick boards, milled smooth, mounted horizontally like siding. The transition from dark, massive logs to lighter planking created a visual discontinuity that made the cabin look unfinished or incorrectly built. Matthias Keller visited in late September and stood staring at the half-log, half-plank structure with obvious bewilderment. "Why change materials midway?" Matthias asked. "Structural weakness at the transition point. Upper level won't support roof weight properly." Alistair was installing the large 3-panel window in the upper gable. He paused to explain. "Lower logs store heat. That's their purpose. Upper level doesn't need to store heat because heat rises from below. Upper section just needs to contain living space and provide ventilation. Planks are adequate for that and lighter for the lower level to support." "That window will bleed heat," Matthias said, pointing at the 3-panel configuration. "Glass is a terrible insulator." "Heat source is below the window," Alistair replied. "Warm air rises past the glass before it can lose significant temperature. The window provides light without creating a cold zone." Matthias shook his head, but stayed to watch. Alistair's fireplace construction was equally unconventional. Most cabins place the fireplace on an exterior wall for easier chimney construction. Alistair built his fireplace at the lower level near the door, an interior position that required more complex chimney routing. The firebox was larger than standard, built with stones he had selected for their density and heat retention properties. The chimney rose through both levels, a stone column that would absorb heat and radiate it to both floors. Alistair designed the upper level as a loft space, with the large window providing light and ventilation. The sleeping area would be warmest, positioned directly above the heat source. Rory Quinn arrived as Alistair worked on the roof frame. The steep pitch was designed for snow load, angled at 45 degrees to shed accumulation while maintaining structural integrity under weight. "It looks like 2 different buildings stacked together," Rory said. "It's one building with 2 functions," Alistair replied. "Heat storage below, living space above." "If you say so. I still think you're mad." The cabin was finished by mid-October 1858. Alistair and Duncan moved in as the first significant snowfall blanketed the valley. The interior was sparse but functional. A sleeping platform in the upper loft, a table and chairs at the lower level, shelves mounted to the walls, and the massive stone fireplace that dominated the space near the door. Everything smelled of pine tar and fresh-cut wood. The first test came in early November, when temperatures dropped to -20 degrees. Alistair built a fire in the evening, a modest blaze that he fed until the firebox held a solid bed of coals. Then he went to sleep, letting the fire burn down naturally rather than maintaining it through the night. In his previous cabin, this would have been dangerous. The interior temperature would have plummeted within hours. He woke 6 hours later to check conditions. The fire had died to barely glowing embers. Outside, the thermometer read minus 22 degrees. Inside, Alistair estimated the temperature at 48 degrees. The thick logs were warm to the touch. They had absorbed heat during the evening burn and were now radiating it back into the cabin's interior. Duncan slept comfortably in the loft without shivering. Alistair added wood to the coals and the fire came back easily. Within an hour, the interior temperature climbed to 60 degrees. The cabin didn't just maintain heat. It amplified the efficiency of every piece of firewood burned. The logs acted exactly as Alistair had theorized, storing thermal energy and releasing it slowly over time. As winter deepened, snow accumulated around the lower level. By December, the dark log section was partially buried, drifts building against the walls until only the upper 3 courses remained visible above the snow line. Alistair had anticipated this. The snow created an additional insulation layer, trapping heat inside the log mass and preventing it from escaping to the exterior air. The cabin became warmer as winter progressed, not colder. Firewood consumption dropped dramatically. Alistair calculated he was using 1/3 the wood he had burned the previous winter. The fireplace required feeding only twice per day, morning and evening. The rest of the time, the stored heat in the logs maintained comfortable temperatures. On the coldest nights, when the thermometer read minus 35 or minus 40, the interior never dropped below 45 degrees, even with minimal fire. Rory Quinn visited during a cold snap in January. He stepped inside and stopped, surprised by the warmth. Alistair's fire was burning, but not roaring, just a steady, modest flame. Yet the interior felt as warm as Rory's own cabin, where he maintained a constant, large fire. "How is it so warm?" Rory asked. "Your fire's barely burning." Alistair placed Rory's hand on one of the massive lower logs. The wood was warm, almost hot to the touch, despite being 3 feet from the fireplace. "The logs hold heat," Alistair explained. "They absorb it when the fire burns high, release it when the fire burns low. The wood itself becomes the heat source." Rory stood quietly, understanding finally clicking into place. "You built a cabin that remembers fire." November 15, 1859. Alistair woke to a sky the color of old iron and air that felt wrong in his lungs. The temperature had dropped overnight, falling from 20 degrees to 0, and continued dropping through the morning. By noon, the thermometer outside read minus 10. By evening, minus 20. The barometric pressure was plummeting. Something large was coming. The snow began just after dark. Light flakes at first, then heavier, then a curtain of white so dense that Alistair couldn't see the woodpile 30 feet from his door. The wind arrived an hour later, howling down from the mountains with a sound like tearing metal. Temperature continued falling, minus 25, minus 30. The blizzard had arrived. Alistair secured Duncan in the loft and checked his supplies. Firewood stacked inside near the fireplace. Enough for 5 days of normal burning. Smoked meat hanging from the rafters. Water barrels filled before the storm hit. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans. They were prepared. He built up the fire and settled in to wait. Day 2 brought worse conditions. The wind never stopped. Snow accumulated at a rate Alistair had never witnessed, building drifts that buried the lower level of his cabin completely. Only the upper plank section and roof remained visible above the white. The temperature reached minus 40. Visibility was 0 beyond 10 feet. Alistair could hear trees cracking in the forest, sap freezing, and splitting the trunks with sounds like rifle shots. He maintained a modest fire and watched through his 3-panel window. Across the valley, he could see Rory Quinn's cabin when the blowing snow briefly cleared. Smoke poured from Rory's chimney, thick and constant. Rory was burning wood at an unsustainable rate, feeding his fire desperately to keep his conventional cabin warm. Alistair's own fire burned steady but small. The buried log level held heat like a stone oven, the snow itself adding insulation that made his cabin warmer as conditions outside became more lethal. Day 3. The storm intensified, minus 42 degrees. Alistair had never experienced cold this extreme. His breath froze instantly when he cracked the door to check conditions. He sealed it again immediately. The blizzard showed no signs of weakening. Through brief breaks in the whiteout, he continued watching Rory's cabin. The smoke was less thick now. Rory was rationing wood or running low. Day 4. No smoke from Rory's cabin in the morning. Then a thin column in the afternoon. Then thick smoke again by evening. Alistair recognized the pattern. Rory was burning furniture, floorboards, anything combustible. His woodpile had run out. Day 5 brought the moment Alistair had been dreading. Late afternoon, visibility briefly improved to perhaps 50 feet. He saw movement near Rory's cabin. Figures emerged, 4 of them, struggling through waist-deep snow. They were heading toward Alistair's chimney smoke, the only substantial column visible across the valley. Rory Quinn was abandoning his frozen cabin, bringing his family through a killing blizzard because Alistair's cabin was the only shelter left that promised warmth. Alistair opened the door before they could knock. Rory Quinn stumbled through first, ice crusted in his beard, eyes wild with cold and exhaustion. Bridget came next, carrying their youngest child wrapped in blankets. Their older son, maybe 7 years old, staggered in last, shaking so violently he could barely stand. All 4 were hypothermic, faces white, movements clumsy. Alistair pulled them inside and sealed the door against the shrieking wind. The contrast was immediate and stark. Outside, minus 42 degrees and dying wind. Inside, perhaps 55 degrees, warm enough that Duncan played comfortably in the loft. The Quinns stood dripping melted snow, staring at the modest fire in Alistair's fireplace as if they didn't understand what they were seeing. "Your fire's so small," Rory said through chattering teeth. "How is it warm?" Alistair was already stripping wet outer layers from the children, wrapping them in dry blankets, positioning them near the fireplace. Bridget collapsed into a chair, sobbing with relief or shock or both. Her hands were white with frostbite beginning. "How long has your cabin been cold?" Alistair asked. "Since this morning," Rory said. 12 hours, maybe 14. We burned everything, furniture, bed frames, floorboards, ran out at dawn, tried to keep warm under blankets, but the cold—" He trailed off, looking at his children. "We were dying. I could feel it happening. Your smoke was the only hope." Alistair fed the fire, adding logs that brought the blaze up without making it wasteful. He prepared hot broth from dried meat, forcing the Quinns to drink slowly despite their hunger. Bridget's crying gradually subsided. The children stopped shaking. Color returned to faces that had been death pale. The warmth of the cabin worked on them like medicine. "I don't understand," Rory said after an hour. "We burned 10 times the wood you're burning. Our cabin was never this warm. Even with a roaring fire it was cold. How are you comfortable with this?" He gestured at Alistair's modest fire. Alistair placed Rory's hand on one of the massive lower logs, now completely buried under exterior snow, but warm inside. The logs, 16 to 18 inches thick, they absorb heat for hours when fire burns, then radiate it back for hours after. The wood itself stores warmth. And the snow outside buries the lower level, traps the heat inside instead of letting it escape. Rory's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something like shame. "I called you mad last summer, watching you dig that foundation, buying those massive logs. I said you were wasting timber and effort on a cabin that would never work better than conventional building. I was wrong. You saved our lives." The blizzard continued outside. Day 6, Day 7, Day 8. The storm raged for 9 days total, the worst weather event in Montana Territory's recorded history. 8 people survived in Alistair's cabin, designed for 2, warm and safe, while the world outside tried to kill everything it touched. The blizzard ended on Day 9 with eerie suddenness. The wind stopped. The snow ceased. Temperature remained at minus 45 degrees, but the sky cleared to a blue so bright it hurt to look at. Alistair and Rory ventured outside into a world transformed into absolute white. Snow had buried everything. Drifts reached 12 feet in places. The landscape was unrecognizable. They walked to Rory's cabin first. The structure still stood, but the interior was destroyed, furniture broken and burned, floorboards torn up and consumed. The cabin had gone cold and stayed cold for 4 days before the Quinns fled. Everything inside had frozen solid, including water barrels that had burst when ice expanded. The cabin was technically intact, but functionally ruined. Matthias Keller's homestead was 3 miles away. The journey took 2 hours through deep snow. They found Matthias and his wife alive but traumatized. Matthias had burned everything combustible, including his spare lumber, tools with wooden handles, and part of his furniture. His cabin had stayed barely warm enough to prevent death, but not warm enough for comfort. His wife's hands showed frostbite damage. They had survived, but barely. 2 other homesteads in the valley told worse stories. The Hendersons, a family of 4 who had arrived from Missouri the previous spring, were found frozen in their cabin. They had apparently run out of fuel on day 6. The Porters, an older couple, had died together, wrapped in blankets, near their dead fireplace. The blizzard had killed 6 people within a 20-mile radius. It would have killed 10 without Alistair's cabin. Word spread through the scattered settlements as survivors traveled to Fort Benton and beyond. The story took on a simple, powerful form. During the worst blizzard in territorial history, one cabin stayed warm with minimal fuel, while conventional cabins became death traps. The difference was construction method: thick logs for thermal mass, partial burial for insulation, 2-level design for efficient heat distribution. Spring 1860 brought rebuilding. Rory Quinn approached Alistair in March and asked for help designing a new cabin. "Teach me what you know," Rory said. "I won't make the same mistake twice." They worked together through April and May. Rory's new cabin followed Alistair's principles: thick logs for the lower level, excavated foundation, plank upper section. The construction took longer than conventional methods, but Rory had learned that speed meant nothing if the result couldn't protect his family. Matthias Keller followed suit, then others. By 1862, 9 cabins in the Montana Territory had been built using what people started calling the McLeod method. The name spread through informal channels. Trappers talked. Settlers shared information. Pastor Grimshaw, traveling through the region in 1861, wrote letters describing the innovation to colleagues in other territories. The technique wasn't adopted universally. Many settlers still built conventionally, either from ignorance or unwillingness to invest extra effort, but those who faced severe winters and understood what cold could do to inadequate shelter built thick-logged, partially buried cabins that kept their families alive when nature turned lethal. Alistair McLeod died in 1875 at the age of 63. His death was unremarkable by frontier standards, a pneumonia that developed during a mild winter and took him within a week. Duncan, now 20 years old, inherited the homestead and continued working the land his father had claimed. The cabin remained functional, still warm, still efficient. Duncan raised his own family there, and his children grew up in the structure their grandfather had built, from grief and obsessive focus on a single problem. The cabin stood for decades after Alistair's death. Through the 1880s and 90s, as Montana transitioned from territory to statehood, as railroads replaced wagon trails and towns replaced scattered homesteads, the McLeod cabin remained. New settlers occasionally discovered it, abandoned by then, and marveled at the construction. The thick, dark logs of the lower level, still solid after 40 years. The lighter plank upper section, weathered but intact. The design that made no immediate sense until someone explained the principle behind it. The technique Alistair had developed influenced frontier architecture across the northern Rockies for 3 decades. Variations appeared in Wyoming, Idaho, and the Dakota Territories. Not every builder understood the complete theory, but the core concept spread organically. Thick logs hold heat better than thin logs. Partial burial provides insulation. Two-level construction with the heat source below distributes warmth efficiently. These ideas persisted because they solved real problems and saved actual lives. Modern historians estimate that several dozen families survived extreme winters specifically because they built cabins using McLeod's principles or variations thereof. The exact number is impossible to determine because survival rarely generates documentation. People don't write letters describing the winter they didn't freeze. They simply continue living. But references exist in territorial records, settler diaries, and newspaper accounts from the period. Mentions of thick logged cabins and buried wall construction appear with enough frequency to suggest the technique achieved genuine regional adoption. The physics behind Alister's success were simple but poorly understood in his era. Thermal mass stores heat energy. Wood with greater volume stores more energy than wood with less volume. Earth at depths below the frost line maintains stable temperatures regardless of surface conditions. Snow provides excellent insulation when trapped against a structure. These principles were not secret, but their application to frontier cabin construction required someone to make the conceptual leap from root cellars to habitation. Alister McLeod made that leap because he watched his wife die in a cabin that couldn't hold heat. His innovation came from necessity channeled through obsession. He built something that worked not because he was brilliant, but because he refused to accept that the conventional answer was the only answer. The result was a cabin that remembered fire, that stored warmth in its massive logs and released it slowly over hours, that turned snow from a threat into insulation, that survived the worst blizzard in territorial history while keeping 8 people alive with a fraction of the fuel that killed their neighbors. The impossible had become routine. A cabin that could survive winter without constant fire wasn't fantasy, it was engineering.